We're back with Kevin, who's going to give us this month's
Hello.
update on Graphite. I'll hand it over to
Yes.
you.
Thanks for having me this month again. So, to anyone who's just tuning in for the first time and you just need an overview of what Graphite is, we're basically aiming to make the ultimate 2D graphics editor for any kind of thing ranging from game development to graphic design to photo editing, basically anything in the creative arts that you would be using for something that you need 2D tools for. The idea is to have a node graph that actually powers the entire backend, but still provide a front end, sort of like the user experience, the interface that you're used to in something like Photoshop or GIMP, which basically provides you a way of working with tools to modify your image. But then those tools will end up actually modifying a node graph for you, encoding the image in a more data-oriented way instead of a pixel-oriented way. Here is sort of our first update. We do have a few UI changes to this mockup, so we're actually getting relatively close now in our roadmap towards reaching this mockup, but what you're seeing here is a mockup. This is what we're designing. We have a new button in the left here. That is the node graph button. So you would click that to cause it to overlay the node graph on top, and then you can see it becomes active. So before and then after. And this node graph looks somewhat similar to what you might have seen before, but we've made some relatively important changes that have made it, I think, well, first of all, it looks nicer. We're sort of leaning into this sort of glass aesthetic where it diffuses the color beneath it by blurring the background. But we're also just making it a little bit easier to view different nodes without being distracted by how the nodes transit data between each other. And then we're also making it so now we have the thumbnails displaying the value of the data directly in line. So you can see you have the image, and then you can preview that image by seeing what data is actually flowing to the next node. And then here's the shape. You can see that we have some vector data. That's what blue represents. Blue is the color for vector data, and it flows, and you can see a preview of what it looks like into the mask layer. So that vector shape is being automatically coerced into a raster type to be fed in as a mask. Then you can see it travels through, and you end up transforming it. Then you apply a motion blur to it, and finally this becomes your layer. So what you're seeing here is basically a layer, and a layer is something you give it a name. It kind of acts like a folder in your structure, in your layer tree. But it's composed of nodes. So the nodes build the data that enters and becomes the layer. And then layers get stacked on top of each other vertically. So the flying jet is going to end up being put on top of the Death Valley backdrop. And then finally, that Death Valley backdrop is provided by two other layers. So basically, this is describing a folder where this layer is acting as a folder where it contains these two. And each of these two are individually composed of something. But here's where you can see the really powerful part about the node graph. This backdrop here is actually an image that's imported, but it's providing its data to both layers. And that's something you definitely could not do in a traditional layer-based editor, because you couldn't import something once and then use it in two separate layers to feed the data. So in this case, we have the image being used directly for the landscape, but we also have it being used to feed in the input for a magic wand selection. So the magic wand selection lets you pick a certain color, and in this case, we are picking the blue.
We're getting some interesting graphical bugs. I'm going to check on the YouTube as well, but it's like stuttering a little bit with the mouse. You might need to reshare your screen here.
Okay. It's possible my mouse is just disappearing. Is that the only problem?
It's not disappearing. It's just appearing a lot of times everywhere all at once.
Oh, weird. Maybe I should restart the screen share.
It is quite curious.
Is that possibly better?
Let me take a look here. I don't think so. So what it does is it like grabs your cursor every few seconds and then like leaves it at that location.
Weird.
We'll keep going for now and then see how it is.
If it's terribly distracting, we could try and resolve it. Otherwise, we might just live with it.
I think live with is fine.
Okay. But anyways, that's mostly an overview of the node graph, and the layer tree on the right is actually just the same thing, all the exact same data, but it's represented in more of a traditional classic layer panel style. So when you don't have the layer panel open, so if you click on this open the overlay node graph button, and you end up back in your actual canvas view, then you can see that you can just modify the layers directly, and that's with a slightly modified design, but it's relatively similar to previous months that we've shown. But that hopefully goes into a little bit more detail because we don't normally talk in detail about how this works. So basically, you get to use something that you're sort of used to already in existing editors like GIMP and Photoshop, but then you can also take sort of a Houdini or Blender geometry nodes or Blender shading nodes or like a Nuke style compositing approach to modifying your documents, even though it also works with the layer panel directly. And that's something that's pretty novel. I don't think there's anyone else doing a layer panel and a node graph that represent the same thing. Anyways, with that overview provided, which also includes some of the UI changes that we've worked on in the past couple months, and especially some polishing changes to the UI in the last month, now we can talk about some of the changes from this past month. So in the actual code. So the first big thing is that the journey in migrating from our front-end framework of Vue to Svelte has completed. This was something that I had started a few months ago, but we ended up having a bunch of regressions that sort of made it impossible to actually fully finish the port, which had a problem where it basically meant we had two front ends. We had the actual production front end, and we had a buggy one that should have been identical but had some bugs. And there are still a few bugs, but we fixed almost all of them. And the ones that still exist are apparently not important enough that we have not noticed them yet. However, if you as a viewer of this, and hopefully a fan of Graphite, are interested in helping us find more of these regressions, please visit issue 1040 on the Graphite repository. And there is a link to provide a direct comparison to the two different builds. One is running Vue and one is running Svelte without any other changes between the two. And if you can find bugs in the Svelte version and then make sure that they don't also exist in the Vue version, please help out by writing a comment describing those regressions that you find, since we want to fix every single one of them, but we don't currently know what all of them are. So that's basically just digging into every single little feature and seeing if anything breaks. Anyway, so with that completed, I will be showing off now the Svelte version, except nothing looks any different. It looks identical, so there's nothing really to point out. But I will then move on to the next one, which is saying that we completed some node graph engineering work on the node graph type checking. So what this basically means is now in the node graph, you can plug data types, plug different nodes which have different data types into each other, and if they're not compatible, they will actually tell you that it's not compatible and reject the attempt to connect it, rather than previously, which did not succeed nearly as gracefully. And this, of course, allows us to do a number of other things now that it's possible to know what data types are compatible with which things. So we can, for example, allow you to delete a node. So this will be something we work on soon. Deleting a node, and if the input and output data types are actually identical, we end up just reconnecting the two to each other to pretend that the thing that was connected before the node and after the node are now actually connected, pretending like you never had that node in the first place. So that will help allow you to delete something without having to reconnect it. We now have, so I also can't really show the node graph type checking very easily, but because it just works better now. But we do have another feature, which is kind of cool. This is a configurable choice between panning and zooming when you use the scroll wheel. So some people prefer to scroll with the scroll wheel moving up and down like it's a web page, whereas other people, maybe if you're using Blender, you prefer to have the scroll wheel actually zoom in. So now that I enable that in the preferences, you can see that by default we end up zooming, and now if you hold the shift key while you're scrolling, that actually becomes a proper vertical scroll, and then also the control key would be horizontal, just like normal. But then if you disable that, we're back to now vertical scrolling, and now you hold the control key if you want to zoom. So that provides you the way to work with whatever you're familiar with. And then additionally, we have the same thing in the node panel as well, in the node graph. So you can either middle click to pan, or you can go up and down with a scroll wheel, or if you enable zoom with scroll, you end up being able to pan around like that, to zoom around like that. And then of course, as before, hold shift to go vertically and Control to go horizontally. And then, of course, simple as opening up the editor preferences, you can either get that from file preferences or the command or control comma key. And that is a nice way to start having more preferences for things that people have, well, preferences for. So yes, the next item is we do have some general UX improvements to vector editing. So with a path tool selected, I'm actually going to delete this thing now here. So I can go ahead and, let's just say I make a shape. Let's make it a new color. Let's go with that. So now I can select several different anchor points. And then if I decided, actually I want all of them selected, I just select in the middle. Or I can deselect all of them by selecting out of it. So I can click between them now. And the first time you click, all of them get selected. And if you click on any subsequent anchor point, it replaces the selection. So this is in line with more of your general expectations for when you're selecting things, like even if you're just selecting files in a file explorer. That is more how you expect things to work, where if you click once, you deselect everything else. And then if you click the entire shape, it selects all of them by default, so that way you can say, hey, I want all of them except that one selected, so you're going to shift-click to deselect just that one. And then, of course, you can drag around the point. Now, this, I think, previously did not work as well, where you could not drag around the selection and edit through those means. So that is one simple improvement. We also now have the pen tool. So the pen tool allows you to draw shapes, but what we now have is the ability to hold down Control to lock the angle. So now, wherever I move my mouse, I'm locking the angle to how I already started. So I can move it here and now hold Control and lock the angle. So this allows you to be more precise. You can say, I want to go in this direction to this point, but then I want to extend beyond that point. So it's a very simple way to control the direction. And I don't think there's any other editors that I'm aware of that really let you do that with a pen tool. So that's helpful. And then finally, one really cool feature here is the ability to select nested layers in a more intuitive way. So you get to choose now if you want to be in what we previously had as the default, which is shallow select mode. What this basically means is, the default has been deep select mode. And what this means is, even though this triangle here is deeply held within a bunch of folders, we're selecting the deepest item. So we're always going to select the actual shape or the actual layer directly, even if it's deep inside of a folder. So whatever you click on is just what gets selected. But now if you go to shallow select mode, you can click on the triangle, and then you actually end up selecting the shallowest item. So that's the upmost parent folder. And then to go inside of that, you just double click. And as long as you're double clicking on a shape that is within your selection, you end up actually going down one layer. And now we're in this folder, which holds all the shapes except for the outermost shape. Now if I just keep double clicking, I get closer and closer. Now I'm selecting the folder that contains the triangle, and I double click one more time, and I end up having the triangle itself selected. And now I can click on, for example, the this outer shape, and because it is contained as a parent of because it's contained within a parent folder, we end up selecting the shape directly. But now we have to go and double click again to get down. So this provides much more control, especially if you're doing something with a lot of nesting. For example, you might be designing a UI and you have a bunch of different rectangles representing different parts of your UI. You want to be able to control which parts you're selecting, so you could, for example, drag an entire panel around within the UI you might be designing without having to go through and select every single one of them. You just select sort of that general region, that whole panel, rather than all the shapes that make up the panel. So that makes it much more convenient to choose if you want shallow select or if you want the default, which is deep select, and basically that changes nothing. Additionally, in shallow select mode, if I want to not have to double click a bunch of times to get to here, you can basically just hold the control key, and that allows you to do a deep selection. So you simply want to say, I want to select the deepest item, just hold control, and even though you're in shallow select mode, it will select the deepest. And then you could even, for example, add that to your selection. So I want to have this one, I want to have this artwork selected, and I want to also add it. I just Control-Shift-Select, and that will add it to the selection. So that makes it much easier to generally manipulate layers that are in the nesting structure. And that concludes the changes for this month. And for the following month, for this upcoming month, we have decided to delay the announcement for Alpha Milestone 2 until we make a few more readiness goals, essentially. We want to fully switch over to the the node-based panel, which replaces the existing layer panel with a node system. Sort of as I talked about, where we have the dual node graph and layer panel in the earlier part when I showed the mockup. We want to implement all of those concepts before we end up releasing, and hopefully we can get that done in the next couple of months. So yeah, if you want to get involved, I did previously mention the easiest way to get involved would be helping us to QA test and check for regressions between these two features. Just check out issue 1040. And besides that, please go ahead and get involved by, well, first of all, just trying out the editor. And you can do that at editor.graphite.rs. And you can also visit us on the website, which is graphite.rs. And also, please join our Discord. We just have a friendly community of just people who use the editor and are interested in the project. So feel free to just hop on and say hi, or even just hop on and don't say hi and just lurk. Any of that's good. So you can find the invite link at discord.graphite.rs. And then we have a lot of issues that are labeled as beginner friendly. They are listed as good first issue on GitHub. And even some really small issues that are specifically curated just for beginners. So if you do want to pick that up, we're very happy to provide you some guidance and make it a friendly place to get started with open source. So yeah, thank you for watching.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Kevin. We have a few questions in chat that I'm curious about. One of them is there a CLI for Graphite, either now or planned?
There is definitely one planned, yes. The idea is we would like to be able to provide the ability to edit your documents in sort of a programmatic way. This is something that we have architected the entire application for, with the intention of making it so you can edit the documents, either in a headless mode with a CLI or with an API, and not just the documents themselves, but you can also render them. So you could pre-create documents, like probably in the editor, because that's the easiest way to do it. But of course, you could modify them or create them from scratch with a CLI or an API. And that way you can programmatically have a document, change it, and then render it on the fly. And the idea is we even want to provide a runtime that you could embed in. For example, you can embed it in your game. And that way you could run the Graphite documents and render them in your game and use them as textures. So you could either do that for like UI design. So you might have a character's health bar, and you would feed in a parameter which is the percentage of the player's health, and maybe any abilities or their mana or different other traits that they have. Feed those in as data, and then that would procedurally render your UI for that purpose. Or you could even have actual like model textures. So as the player's walking through mud over time, that mud starts accumulating on their clothes and on their weapons and on their gear. We could re-render the texture every so often and replace that with the existing texture that's applied to the models to provide something more contextual to where the user is, what their environment is. If they're walking through mud, if they're walking through snow, you might accumulate different procedural effects on your models and textures for that. So that's the idea, is to have a very modular way of designing the Graphite architecture so that you can use it in many different contexts outside of just the editor itself. And then the idea is even that we have the editor itself is somewhat generic or somewhat modular by comparison to our front end. So you, in the future, could implement your own Graphite editor in, for example, I think we've talked about this as sort of a general idea, but someday in the future, Bevy could implement their own texture editor, and they could use the Graphite editor, but implement their own front end and their own UI for it, and be able to pick specifically the features they want to focus on, but be able to still implement that using the Graphite backend. So it would still use the Graphite document format, and it would still use the render engine and the tool system, but you could basically use which tools you want and apply that as necessary, or basically as the way that fits your needs.
Yeah, okay. So I'll be honest, when that question was asked, I didn't really understand what it could mean, but some of these use cases you presented are so powerful that I've never thought of before. This idea that when I'm in a game engine, when I'm editing stuff, I click on the color bar and I do the color picker or something like that. But if that could just be gateway to Graphite's backend, and I could pull up the Graphite node Graphite if I wanted the front end, or I could do stuff in whatever way, so that I can really dive so much deeper. Like that is an idea I've never considered before, but that's so powerful. And then also I didn't so when you said at first you could load the texture in, add some like mud to someone who's like running through mud or something like that. I'm like, that doesn't, in my mind, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you want to have like all of Photoshop there? But I'm like, wait a second, Graphite's pretty modular, it's probably pretty small. Would it be something that you could just ship with your game? Like, is that sort of the idea?
That's what I was describing. Yes, you would ship the runtime environment, so that essentially is the code that does the rendering, and then you ship your documents, and these documents describe how your texture looks. So your character's gear or whatever, and then because these are really small, they would render. The documents themselves are just a description of a node graph. They're not a bunch of pixels, so it's actually going to take up less space by comparison to a texture. And as long as you have the budget in your frame rates, or either your frame rates or your loading, to run and render this graph ahead of time, or at runtime, if you can spare if you can do it slowly, if you don't have to render every single texture in your entire game at once, except when you're maybe loading the game at the beginning, then I think you can probably spare the frames just to re-render, just your character's texture. But basically, in that case, it would only be, a few kilobytes, but you'd render the entire texture based upon the current context. So if it's snowing, if it's muddy, if the character just walked inside of water and washed off the mud, you get to re-render that at runtime by simply shipping our library, which would be the renderer, plus your own actual art files, the actual art itself, and those will be really small, like several kilobyte sized files, instead of
That's
having
so
to ship
crazy
large
to me.
textures.
I've never thought about this dynamic side of like art in games, and so that would be super cool. Path to kind of see stuff.
This is something that Substance Designer does. They do have a runtime that some games do ship, but I guess it's not that popular because typically game developers do find it easier just to export the texture ahead of time. But I do think I think Metro Exodus does that. That game does it where you over time, as you're walking through the environment, your weapons do end up getting muddier and more beat up. So basically, it's that idea, but in an open source and hopefully more nicely implemented manner.
If you approach it from the perspective of this is what the outcome is, and so we're going to build the ergonomics for it, instead of having like, we've made this big photo application and how are we going to expose a small part of it to a game or something.
I mean, that was the very first month we even started working on this code. We first started thinking, what are our goals here for how people will use this in a portable manner, and that's how we ended up building the architecture to support these use cases.
Okay, awesome. Now, one more question we have here, and this is a question that I'm particularly interested about, because we often answer the same question about Valorant, but what features are needed before Graphite can become the default 2D editor for general 2D graphics? And I think the thing I want to add on here is it's very difficult to know when you would release a 1.0 of something or when something is complete. But in your mind, what are the things that you want to see?
Yeah, actually, let me answer that question with a roadmap.
I think Zola died there.
Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. So we do have a roadmap here.
Okay.
Wait,
is this roadmap? Is it out yet?
Is it working?
Yes. Sorry. Is the roadmap out yet, or is it still like?
We're still working on this update to the website.
Okay,
the small change is that I think we're actually going to move Alpha Milestone 2, which is the upcoming release here, down to, I think, here. One more.
Okay.
So, one more beyond that too. So we actually want to complete these features before we end up switching to Alpha Milestone 2, which will be the next year or so of development. We want to work on adding a brush tool, web GPU in supported browsers, so that will provide GPU acceleration, vertical compositing of nodes. So that's the idea where you saw that everything that is everything is basically a layer, and everything is either a node or those nodes that feed into a layer and allow you to composite them on top of each other by stacking them. The node-based layer tree, which means replacing the existing layer tree, which is sort of a stopgap measure to provide some sort of layers that we can use before we had the full node graph built. This will be representing the graph data structure in that layer panel. And then graph-based documents basically means that we will have switched away from those legacy layers and we'll have an entire single document that describes, a single graph that describes your entire document, rather than having a bunch of separate layers with separate graphs in each layer, which is sort of our transitional phase. We're trying to get from layers to documents. And then we're going to be having finally finishing the infrastructure needed to deploy a Tari app. So providing people the ability to download and update Graphite through
Awesome.
the web. We'll just have a download button on the website. And then finally, custom subgraph document nodes, which basically means you can make a graph and then make it reusable. So you just make some procedural thing, perhaps, that does something, and then just encapsulate that in a graph, and then you can reuse that as a node. So that will be sort of our roadmap in the next couple months. Hopefully, that's a little optimistic.
Yeah.
But we want to complete those because that will be like the point at which Graphite has fully become a graph-based, like a node graph-based editor, as opposed to our current approach, which is we had to use nodes in the short term because we didn't have a node graph, and now we're doing all the node graph engineering work to fully switch this over. And then Alpha Milestone 2, sort of just very briefly, it's going to be all the sort of things needed to make it useful as an editor. So this gets back to answering the original question. This is just going to be a lot of making the node graph more useful, so you can sort of provide metadata that flows along with the rest of your data. So you could give it like color information, and then a downstream node ends up using that color information when it ends up turning points into shapes or something. Procedural vector data is going to replace our existing vector data format with something that is much more conducive to use with vector stuff. Finally, importing SVG, because we really need to import SVG, but we just haven't built a parser for it yet because it's actually a decent amount of work. Then we're going to be switching over to the Velo renderer. Instead of using SVG for our render engine, we'll be switching over to Velo. Looking forward to getting that done because that's going to hopefully improve performance considerably. And then select mode and masking, allowing you to basically use the existing tools as sort of a lasso selection or as a marquee selection. You can use the pen tool in place of the polygonal lasso tool that you might be familiar with in Photoshop. You can use just the rectangle tool instead of the rectangle marquee tool. Basically, you use the existing tools to make a mask, but you do that in a way that still shows you the marching ants, and those marching ants then become used as your selection when you actually change other things. Just sort of quickly going over the rest of these without having to talk about each one individually, some refactoring. This would be the concept of a resolution agnostic renderer where you can zoom in forever and it just keeps re-rendering everything at the higher resolution. A better snapping system just to help improve the UX for snapping and doing more pixel perfect work. And then also having rustc that runs on a server and can compile specific changes. So if you're working on if you want to make your own custom node by writing a Rust shader, you write the shader using Rust, and it becomes CPU or GPU compiled.
And it's just serverless at that point.
Yeah, so we do have to provide a compiler, so we have to be able to do something like the Rust sandbox where it has a web-based compiler. We need that infrastructure. Or if you're running it locally and you have Rust installed on your environment, then you just do it locally. Then we'll have a custom code editor, so you can write your own code directly in the editor using like the VS Code Monaco editor that we build right into the web page. And then a document history system, so you can actually sort of have like a Git-like history tree of your changes. And then finally, culminating in a stable document format, so we don't keep breaking your documents every single time we make updates every day. Sorry that we do that, but we don't really have a good way of doing it until we can properly design a backwards and forwards compatible document format. If anyone, by the way, has any expertise in designing file formats that are meant to be robust, we need to consult with people who have experience with that because we have never done that before. So that's something we do need help with.
I might need to cut us off
yeah.
here just in the effort of time.
Yes.
But yeah, this
I'm
is
just
super
gonna
cool to
scroll down,
see.
so anyone who wants to see the rest of the roadmap here, I'm not going to go through each one of them because this would take a really long time.
Yeah, there's a lot.
But
Okay, I
1.0
love this like list of features. This is a lot of really
Yeah.
cool stuff.
My power was out for a week, so I just kind of went and drew a whole bunch of icons.
I love the icons. Like, yeah, they're very authentic. It's super cool.
And then, yeah, we'll eventually get to the 1.0 release, and then after that, here's just a quick taste of things that might come after it, like animation. And then lots of things will keep coming forever.
Yeah, awesome. Great. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for showing off Graphite again this month. I think there's a lot of hype in the chat for like a lot of the stuff that you discussed, as well as some pictures of like the cursors doing some stuff, and so that's gonna be fun to look at later.
I will
But
have
awesome.
to watch
Thank
the
you so
YouTube
much.
stream after this and see what it looks
Yeah.
like.
It was pretty cool. All right. So I guess we will see you next month.
Okay, thanks.